Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
Just before we kick off this midweek episode, I just wanted to put out the request again that if there's anybody who is interested in writing for the Conservative History Journal, I'd be delighted to hear from you. I very recently took over as editor of the journal, and I'm currently putting together some articles for the next edition, which will hopefully be out towards the end of the year. There's already some fascinating themes and subjects in the pipeline, but there's definitely room for others too. So if there's a particular theme in conservative history, whether it's biography or policy or organisation or whatever it might be, please do drop me an email. My email address is in the show notes, and I'd be very glad to have a chat. Richard, returning to our subject, matters of interest, why don't you kick us off?
Well, my matter of interest this week is provoked by an interview that Sir Nick Clegg, the former Deputy Prime Minister, did with the BBC, in which he described the current model for financing higher education in England as indefensible. And Clegg said that he would now be on the barricades advocating wholesale reform of the tuition fee system, which he, of course, helped to bring about when he was in the coalition government with David Cameron in the early 2010s. The coalition government's decision to treble tuition fees from £3,000 to £9,000 was the most controversial aspect of that reform, and that is the part which provoked so many protests by student organizations across the country, and why, in large part, the Liberal Democrats went from being the party that was most popular with students, certainly the students that I interacted with when I was an undergraduate at the time of the 2010 election, to being a totally toxic party for young people and students in particular. But for me, the biggest problem of the coalition government's higher education reforms was not actually the trebling of the tuition fees. The most consequential aspect, in my view, was the removal of the cap on student numbers for university places in England. Now, this is a part of the reform that sometimes is praised by people who are otherwise quite antipathetic to the Conservative Liberal Democrat government. But I actually think it's one of the worst things that government did, among many bad things that government did. So let me first, just for the sake of our listeners who either haven't lived through the old model or are international, let me just explain how higher education funding works. And I'm going to use broad brushstrokes. I'm not an education expert, except for being someone who has gone through the higher education system in this country, and also who now teaches at a university, of course, though I'm, as ever, speaking in my own personal capacity. So before tuition fees came in at all, British higher education was completely government funded. And so what that meant was that the government would agree to fund a certain number of places for each degree at each university in the country. And these numbers were set centrally according to a variety of criteria. Now, that sort of central model, I think, is not a bad model. You could decide to allocate places to universities on a variety of metrics. It could be on the basis of a request from the university. So the university could say, we have X number of academics who can teach foreign languages, and these are the number of students that we would like to teach foreign languages to this year. There could then be a negotiation with the government over that, and the government could say, that seems like a sensible number. The government could come back and say, actually, we think you can take a few more students, or the government could come back and say, actually, that's too many. We're not prepared to fund that number of students for your degree. The number of funded places could change over time, and that could be tied to various metrics. So a university that is performing well might be entitled to make a request for more student numbers, or a university that's not performing well might not be granted its request for more numbers at the next round. There could be other factors at play when the government decides which places to fund. It could be that the government says, well, actually, we don't need more university places in London, but we do need more university places in the Northwest. So we're going to fund more places for students to study physics at a Northwest university, and we're going to slow the growth of students studying economics in the Southeast. Those are ultimately political decisions, but of course decisions that would be informed by civil servants and educational experts. Even after Tony Blair's government, the New Labour government, first introduced tuition fees, this centralised model basically continued throughout the New Labour years. And part of that was because when Blair first introduced fees, first at £1,000 and then at £3,000, still the majority of the costs for educating students was being borne by the taxpayer. And so not unreasonably, the government could say to universities, okay, students are making a contribution to their education. However, the government is paying the lion's share or a significant share of the students' education. And so the government is perfectly entitled to make a decision as to how many places it's prepared to fund. In my view, there are many advantages to this approach. One advantage is that university growth can be managed responsibly. For example, the impact of growing a particular university in a particular town or community can be weighed against the impact that that growth might have on, say, housing that's available in the local area, or just in terms of what the economic needs of that local area might be. Universities under this model were incentivized to compete for quality students. If you know that you're only going to get 10 politics students at your university in a given year, then you want to get the very best politics students coming to your university. And so you might want to try and poach some of those clever sixth form students that might be inclined to go to another university to come to your university. It also meant that the management of universities was done not just in the pure sense of what was good for the bottom line of the university, but wider public considerations were able to be taken into account. The coalition government comes in after the 2010 election, and Conservatives and Liberal Democrats go into their unholy alliance. And they say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to treble tuition fees. So the government is going to reduce its contribution, in fact, remove its contribution, at least nominally, to students coming to university. Students are going to pay for themselves for their place at university. And given that students are going to pay for themselves to go to university, therefore, it doesn't make sense for the government anymore to say, these are the number of university places that we think should be available for this degree at this university. In other words, the government said, we're going to remove the cap on student numbers, and universities will be entitled to recruit as many students as they possibly can. David Willetts, the universities minister who was primarily responsible for this legislation, was a great defender of the removal of the cap. And I can remember a few years after this legislation came into effect, and he came to a dinner at my graduate college, Nuffield College at Oxford, and I had a chance to sit next to him, and I went for him over this reform and told him how bad an idea I thought it was and how unhappy I was with it. But Willetts came back and he said that he thought it was one of the great strengths of the legislation because it meant that universities would compete for students. And universities were incentivized to grow. And the way that universities were incentivized to grow was to attract more students. And so in Willetts' view, better universities would attract more applicants and worse universities would attract fewer applicants. Well, yes and no, because what has ended up happening is that there is an arms race for growth in student numbers. The more students you attract to your university, the more fee income you get, the more money your university has. And so universities since the early 2000s in this country have tried to grow and grow and grow. And why are they growing? Well, it's a good question. I'm not always sure. For some people, they try to make a philosophical argument that this growth is tied to the growth of more students overall in the higher education sector, and more students going to university is a good thing because a university education opens up doors of opportunity. I understand that argument, and I'm sympathetic to certain elements of that argument, but I think that there is a risk that if you devalue a university degree through excessive growth, then the benefits to students, both in terms of the quality of the education that they achieve and the employment outcomes that it may deliver, diminish quite substantially. And so what a lot of this was empire building by university managers who saw bigger as better. If I get more students coming to my university, I can build more buildings, I can hire more staff, I can perhaps even have a higher salary myself, and I can be the king or queen of the great university empire. Now, on this point about universities competing for students, and Willitz's view that students will go to the better universities and the worst universities will have fewer applicants. Well, what is the heuristic that a 17-year-old student would use for understanding what is a better university or a worse university? Well, I think the clearest one is probably historic reputation. And so what this has meant, in my view, is that universities that have average to above average to very good reputations have been able to use those historic reputations to recruit students at much higher rates than they would have been entitled to under the pre-coalition reforms. And universities with lower historic reputations, regardless of the actual quality of the degrees that they're offering, have struggled to recruit. Now you might say, okay, well, that's a good thing. But how have universities in the sort of upper half tried to recruit students? Well, quite often it's by trying to recruit students who would otherwise have gone to the lower half of universities. In other words, by lowering standards. Right? That's one of the easy ways that you can grow numbers is by lowering the entry tariff or the other expectations that you might have for students who are applying to your university. And so what that's meant is that middle to upper middle universities have grown enormously in this country, while some of the more sort of local universities have lost the students that otherwise would have gone to them. And what do those other universities do? Well, it's a combination of lowering their own standards, basically to admit people who would otherwise never have gone to university. And again, people might say that's a good thing. And in some cases, it is a good thing. But quite often, it can mean admitting people to university degrees who are entirely unprepared for the rigor that a university degree ought to carry along with it. They go abroad and recruit abroad. At the moment, many of those universities have become very sensitive to immigration targets the government set and have been pushing for the government not to set immigration targets of a lower level because they see that as part of their funding income. Or if they can't do that, then they may close. So I agree with Nick, to coin a phrase, that this is a total mess, but it is a total mess of his own making, and it's actually the element of the policy for which he is completely unrepentant. It creates an enormous moral hazard where the risks of recruiting students by these universities is borne entirely not by the universities, but by the students and by us, the public, by the taxpayer, because the money that the university receives up front doesn't come from the students or a bank. It comes from the treasury, comes from the government. And that money has to then be paid back by the individual student. And so if universities are admitting students who maybe would be better off not going to university or would be better off going to a different university, the risks that that carries for the university that admits them, my view is actually quite low. And so it just encourages universities to try to grow and grow and grow. And at the end of the day, for me, that runs against some of the things that are the best bits of a good quality higher education, particularly things like lower student numbers, a more personalized tutorial approach, setting high standards, frequent assessment, which become more and more difficult the more and more students that you admit.
Gosh, well, there was a huge amount in that. I'll try and pick out a few points. Starting with what Nick Clegg has said. I mean, I think he's right to say the current system is indefensible. It's quite clearly a mess. I mean, in the United Kingdom right now, if you went to an English university, you'll be in one of a handful of situations. Either you'll have paid no fees because you went before fees were introduced. You may have paid £1,000 in fees when the top-up fees idea was first done. You could have paid £3,000 a year, give or take, in fees, which was what it was when I went to university. You may have paid £9,000 or more in fees, or at least been borrowed the money to cover £9,000 or more in fees if you went in the last decade or so. Or if you were an international student at the time, you may have paid a whole lot more than that. And in that case, probably paid up front rather than through the loans system. All of those people got, to some degree, the same thing. They all got a degree. They've all got the same piece of paper. But in most of those cases, depending upon their age, they ended up being in a dramatically different situation in terms of how that was financed. And that is a rather odd situation for us to be in. It looks chaotic, not planned, and not thought through for the long-term model. If I had to say something briefly in defence of Nick Clegg, which I do very rarely, it is 11 years since he left office as Deputy Prime Minister. And the fact that the system is indefensible today doesn't mean it was indefensible in 2015. And systems are never created and then said, right, that is perfect now, and we don't need to do anything with it. There was a duty and a burden on the politicians who came afterwards to amend the system to make it better. And in some ways, the ways the system has changed has in fact made it worse, you could argue. But nevertheless, there is a reason why this has become so totemic for Nick Clegg's reputation, and there'll be no tears from me on his behalf. When I say that the system is a mess, what do I really mean by that? Well, firstly, that the quality of education that people get across universities is now so wide. There are clearly very good universities out there and very good, hard-working, devoted academics and many good students who want to work hard. There's also places where students very often end up working full-time, so can't really devote a lot of time to their studies, where the standards of assessment in terms of the degree marks that are given out is just wild. Places where a huge number of students get a first, basically the whole meaning of a first is lost, and it's not a reflection of actual quality, certainly not quality over time if you go back 10, 20, 30, 40 years. It's also, and this is one of the things that's been picked out by Clegg and others, not a particularly good deal for students. I mean, if you're a graduate on the current plan, you will pay up to 6% interest on your student loans. That's not a particularly generous form of interest. Most people could go to a bank and pay less on a loan than that. It's generous in other ways, in the sense that the government's not breathing down your neck to take it away from you, because you don't have to pay it back. You only pay it back if you earn over a certain amount. But what does that then end up meaning, in effect, is that if you're in the category of people who historically we may have thought ought to go to university because they go into graduate jobs that then command relatively high salaries, then you end up being absolutely shafted by the current system because you've got a really uncompetitive rate of interest and you're making big payments back, and that debt is with you for a quarter of a century. So you could almost see a generational shift where if you go back a generation or so, you get people who the system thought ought to go to university, got it for free, and then did very well. And today, if you're in that category, you're going to be the most shafted demographic, basically, because you're going to be paying back a lot more money than you ever borrowed to get a graduate job. It is, on a generational basis, I think, deeply unfair. Final thing I just wanted to say on it is I think we can't just, with inertia or a feeling that an alternative is too difficult, stick with the system that we have, because it really isn't working for anyone. And one thing I would really like to see policymakers do is just be massively more creative about this. So, for example, I've always felt it's a bit of an outrage that somebody who starts work at 16 and goes into a manual job has the same retirement age as somebody who gets a state-funded BA, master's, and then a PhD, and then starts a much less physically intensive job at the age of, say, 26, 27. I think for both of those categories of people, to have a fixed retirement age of, say, 67 is actually a pretty absurd way of organizing things. And so I would like to see people model and look at the idea of to say, well, How about we actually go back to the old idea of stamps, like your national insurance stamps almost, for how we fund the pension system. And we say to people, but look, if you don't think university is for you, then we're giving an incentive to go into work and to work earlier on because you'll retire younger. And maybe along the way, they will discover lifelong learning opportunities or vocational learning or FE colleges that we should do much more with instead. And at the same time, you could then say to people who want to go to university, well, look, maybe we can remove the fees for this. Maybe we don't have fees for this anymore. But actually, every year that you're at university, your retirement age goes up by 1. And actually, when you look at what the state pension is, the state pension is currently slightly more than what we pay for a year's fees at university. So maybe actually there's a way you could make those numbers work without having a system that nobody now thinks works, nobody thinks is fair. And that for a lot of graduates in this country, young graduates in their 20s and 30s, hits them with this additional tax at some of the best years of their life when they ought to be saving up for a home or otherwise. I think we've got to be so much more creative about the way in which we think about this. Go back to actually saying, well, what are universities for? And what should the model of who goes to university, what standards universities are meant to enforce, and how do we fund it? How should that actually work? We have to ask really fundamental questions about a sector that clearly doesn't work anymore.
And it feels like there just really hasn't been much serious policy debate on this, really, ever since the coalition government came in. The closest to this was when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, and Corbyn took the view that tuition fees should be abolished. And I was supportive of that because I knew that if tuition fees were to be abolished, then we would have to go back to the old centrally planned model of higher education. And so we would have had to have universities restrict numbers, because, I mean, you couldn't, there's no way you could have a free model of education with no cap on student numbers. That's basically, I mean, that's a total moral hazard for universities. And so obviously the unspoken truth of the Corbyn proposal was that we were going to go back to the way things had been before Tony Blair.
If I can ask the question, do you think Jeremy Corbyn knew the unspoken truth of the Jeremy Corbyn proposal? Because I actually don't think he did. When Jeremy Corbyn was at his peak magic grandpa phase, basically talking about handing money out left, right, and centre to everyone, there was never a sense from Jeremy Corbyn or the Labour Party in 2017 and around this time that actually doing the left-wing populist thing actually required some hard, tough thinking. That saying yes to one group requires saying no to another group. I got no sense from Labour at the time that actually what they were proposing is scrapping fees to reduce the number of people at university.
Well, it's the obvious implication of the policy. So,
Obvious to you, but
well, obvious to anyone. I mean, I assume Corbyn didn't talk about it because it was politically quite explosive. And this is where I get into awkward territory when I propose this with some of my academic colleagues, because basically the unspoken secret of this is that tuition fees have funded a major expansion of universities in terms of not just student numbers, but also in terms of staff. Not just academic staff, I should say. There's been an enormous growth in the professional services and managerial staff attached to universities as a result of this. And basically, abolishing tuition fees would mean that a lot of those people would have to go. They would lose their jobs. It would be a shrinkage, inevitably, of the number of students, perhaps overall going to university, but certainly a shrinkage of the number of students at those universities I mentioned earlier, the sort of middle and upper middle universities, which have hoovered up the applicants who would have otherwise gone to the lower prestige universities. And when I talk about this, I'm not trying to cast aspersions on the actual value of those universities. Many of those lower prestige universities really punch above their weight and do a great job and have historically done a great job for the students who have studied there. But just talking about the heuristics that students use in terms of prestige to go to university. So actually, employees of universities have an incentive to maintain the fee system and not to abolish fees. The managers of universities have an incentive not to abolish fees and to reduce their size and their income, which would be an inevitable consequence of abolishing fees. And actually, many students don't really have that great an incentive in abolishing fees because for some, they are able to go to universities under the current model that they probably wouldn't have been able to go to under the managed placement model, where universities at that middle and upper middle level had fewer places to offer. And they may have had to go to lower prestige universities, or perhaps may not have gone to university at all. And for some people, that's terrible. And for others, there is perhaps an argument to be made that we need to think about, as Lee said, what is the purpose of going to university? Is it a rite of passage for every 18-year-old? Or actually, is there something to be said for thinking that maybe it's one path that people can take, but it may not always be the best path for everyone to take? In terms of policy ideas, I like your idea about a variable retirement age. This has been used in other countries in the past. Greece used to have quite widely varying retirement ages based on the type of job you did until the European Commission came in and basically forced the Greek public to adopt a pension regime that had no democratic consent in Greece. Wonderful example of the authoritarian instincts of the EU and the ECB. But the principle of a variable retirement age is one that I think we ought to consider. And I think there is something to be said for perhaps people who get the benefit of going to university, if we had a system where university was free, being expected to work longer as a result. I think that may be a worthwhile trade-off, at least to consider and look into.
Final thought I would add is really, I think we should be broadening out our thoughts on this to think, what does post-18 education look like in Britain? Because very often missing in the discussion are non-university students and also people who have a desire to learn or would benefit from more education after, say, the age of 21. We've made the system for going to university at 18 or 19 incredibly easy at the moment. It's basically the railway track that almost every student in this country, when they're at high school, has the chance to be put up on, and a great many follow that track. But actually, if you were, say, 25 and suddenly thought, oh, actually, now I might like to study, it's very difficult for people to actually find good avenues for doing that. That might lead to accreditation, and particularly if they're changing careers or they don't find themselves in a situation where their employer is well geared up for it. So it feels like we have a system where all eggs are in the basket of a broken model for undergraduate education. And really, the breadth of thinking that we need to get this right is so much greater than that.
And I'm very pleased that Andy Burnham this week has been talking about the value of other forms of training and education and career trajectories outside of that conveyor belt that seems to have been the default mode increasingly in this country in the last 20 years. So putting more focus on technical education, other forms of education, and giving, I think, advantages to people who don't go to university, either in the tax system or in the employment market, are really worth considering as well. I think university education is going to be a wonderful thing, should be open to people of every background. I believe in that very strongly and passionately, but I also don't think that a university education is the only thing that should lead to a successful and prosperous and meaningful life. Quite the contrary. Lee, what's your matter of interest this week?
Well, I don't think we're talking enough about the extent of local government reorganisation that's going on in this country. There have been, over the decades, over the centuries, these big moments when local government has been shook up. You can go back to 1888, when there was a Local Government Act that brought in county councils in England. You can go back to the 1960s, when local government in London was reformed. We spoke a bit about that in one of our episodes on the 1968 local elections, which was the second time new London councils were voted in. And of course, you can go back to 1972, when the Local Government Act of that year, one of the most reviled in some quarters, pieces of legislation in British history, was introduced. That was a piece of legislation that did a great deal of harm to historic counties, places like Lancashire, for example. Well, some of that went into Cheshire, places like Warrington, some went into Cumbria, places like Barrow and Furness. Merseyside was created in large part out of old bits of Lancashire, and of course Greater Manchester too. It emasculated historic counties in a way some people have never forgotten or forgiven. But the reason why I raise it is that they are remembered in many ways, those big reforms. But we're going through one of the big reforms now. Labour, when it came into office in 2024, said that it wanted to basically end two-tier local authorities in this country. That's places where you have a county council, and then beneath that you have district or city councils. I can give you an example of that, as it's where we live. So Oxfordshire County Council has within it 5 district councils, 1 for Oxford City, and then 4 for surrounding districts. The idea is that all of those will go and new single-tier councils will replace it. The 3 points I wanted to make about this ongoing process. First of all, that I've barely read anything about it in lots of the newspapers. I've barely seen much commentary on it. And in part, I think that's not that surprising. We have a political media which is necessarily and unavoidably is focused a lot on Westminster as the epicenter of English politics, where all of this is taking place. But actually a huge amount is decided and a huge amount of money is spent in local government as well. And I've not really seen that much of a focus on this. And about a third of the country will be going through local government reorganisation at the moment. I mean, that includes large parts of the south and southeast of England, parts of the Midlands, most places like Lancashire and Gloucestershire as well. So a lot of places are going through this, and local government in those parts of the country will change very dramatically. Secondly, I think the process for this, in part, shows one of the things that we get wrong in terms of how we govern the UK. So when the civil service and when government departments have put together the frameworks for what this should look like, we're talking tons of paperwork, lots of arcane rules, hugely bureaucratic processes for what is basically and essentially and ultimately a political decision that gets made in Whitehall. So let me give an example of what I mean by that process. Amidst these reams of papers about how this ought to look, the government set out what was a pretty clear criteria that new councils should be about 500,000 people or more. About 500,000 is what you should aim for if you're looking to get efficiencies in new councils in local government. What has the government done in practice when it's been announcing which local government reorganisation to go with? Basically ignoring that altogether. There are some places where they've stuck to it, so Derbyshire will get 2 councils, both just over 500,000, but some of them are laughably below that. Suffolk will get 3 councils, each just over 250,000. There's a proposed North Lincolnshire Council that will just have about 171,000 people living in it in Lincolnshire, obviously. There are lots and lots of small councils, which will mean lots of duplication of management, and also actually lots of areas which are intimately connected to one another geographically, being broken up into new, relatively small councils. And as part of this process, people suspect foul play. And let me again give you an example of why. In Oxfordshire, 3 proposals were put forward, one by the county council for one big council to cover the whole of Oxfordshire, one by the district councils, which would create 2 councils, one of them bringing in West Berkshire as well. So breaking the county line, so to speak, as it's existed for half a century or so, or certainly the administrative boundary as it's existed in Oxfordshire since the 1970s. And then one put forward by Oxford City Council, which was seen as being a greenbelt land grab by some people. So it expands the boundaries of Oxford City to take in quite a few of the villages surrounding it. The only council in Oxfordshire that is Labour-led is Oxford City Council. They were the only council to propose what was called a 3-unitary option, so the one that includes Greater Oxford. Theirs was the proposal that most went against the government's own criteria around population sizes, and theirs was the one that the government chose to implement. So you end up with this system where It's very hard to have confidence in what the government says. The government wastes huge amount of time producing documents that then local government people process and try to adhere to, that then basically get disregarded, so far as I can tell. Because ultimately, these are political decisions, but they're political decisions that have been approached in a bureaucratic way, when actually there just ought to have been a proper, meaningful political debate about what is the right size for a council and why do we think such is the right size for a council? Should urban and rural areas be represented together or should they be kept apart? These are all good political debates for people and areas to have, but they weren't really the debates that we had at all. Instead, we had bureaucracy that was then disregarded. And thirdly, the very final point I wanted to make on this, for such major changes covering really large parts of England, the process for this is being incredibly rushed in many ways. And I think it's actually really not a very good way of doing things at all. So again, if I parochialise it, forgive me for parochialising it to Oxfordshire. We got the announcement about what our new councils would be a couple of weeks ago. Somewhat bizarrely, just 4 days before we had a new Prime Minister in this country and a new Secretary of State responsible for it. But that's by the by. We're now at the stage where in about 9 months' time, new councils are meant to be elected in our part of the world, but we don't know how many councillors they will have. We don't know what the wards will be. We don't know which of the old councils will manage those first elections. You could even say we don't really know what the boundaries of those councils will be themselves, because lots of councils are going around saying we want the government to think again or considering legal action and so on. And in just 9 months, new councils are meant to be created, which then less than a year on from that will take over services like adult social care, like highways, and much more besides. It feels like it's a real rushed process and a very chaotic way in which to do what is quite possibly the biggest local government reform in England since the 1970s. So, rant over, but I'll end the rant by saying we ought to have, in my view, a lot more focus and scrutiny on the fact that for around about a third of England, local government is changing in a very, very big way.
To put my tuppence worth into this, I support the broad aims of the government's reforms to bring in single-tier local government, unitary councils across England. I think it is absurd and confusing and illogical for many voters, and I include myself in this quite often, and I see myself as someone who is somewhat reasonably informed about local politics, to have to pass between the county and the district council as to who is responsible for what service. Is it intuitive that your rubbish bins are collected by the district council, but the tips where you take your own rubbish are run by the county council? I'm not sure that that is an intuitive thing for voters or for anyone, really. And yet there are lots of examples of this. And so what this often means, and I see it all the time, is not unreasonably, and I'm not blaming the voters here, people see something go wrong in their local area and they get angry at the council, but it turns out that the council they have in mind is the city council or the district council, but actually it turns out that that is a county council responsibility or vice versa, or sometimes the councils themselves are passing responsibility between them, and it's a whole mess. So to me, we're way over time in repealing the Ted Heath local government reforms of the 1970s. The devil, of course, is in the detail. And Lee, you've set out your take that the government has thrown a lot of detail in the faces of councillors and the public about the principles and ideas of how councils might look, and then you object to the decisions that they've made because you argue that they don't follow those particular principles. And you've given the example of Oxfordshire, where the 5 Liberal Democrat controlled councils submitted proposals that didn't really resemble the government's final changes for Oxfordshire, but the Labour City Council in Oxford, the one Labour council in Oxfordshire, who did submit proposals, got most of what they wanted. Well, a rather simpler alternative there, which is just that Labour councillors have better ideas than Liberal Democrat councillors. I think that's quite widely accepted by at least some of our listeners, certainly from me. But no, I mean, to take it seriously, you're right that a lot of these administrative reforms are cloaked in civil service language, but actually they're ultimately quite political decisions. Now, my view on this is that some of that is inescapable. So, one of the reasons why the government puts out all of this kind of rationale and justification for the purposes of its change is to shield it at a later date from judicial review. And you have already mentioned that certain local councils that are being abolished are trying to sue the government over the decisions that have been made about local government reform. And so the government needs to have some kind of paper trail where it can say, this is the process that we follow. I don't like that that's the case. I don't personally think that should be the case, but unfortunately, that's the way that the system has evolved in recent years in Britain. The sooner we move away from that obsession with judicial review, the better, in my view. On the political point, though, when you make changes to systems of voting and representation, there's always going to be a bit of a charge that this is partisan, that you're doing it for your own political advantage. And in some ways, that's almost always inescapable to have that charge put against you. And there are different ways in which politicians try to insulate from that. Sometimes they do so by trying to bring in the opposition parties and have cross-party agreement on the particular electoral reform. Sometimes it's they take the ultimate decision away from themselves and put these things to referendum so that the voters ultimately get the blame for these things, or at least they remove the accountability to politicians. One of the reasons I don't like referendums is they remove accountability. Sometimes you try to make it look as technical a change as possible so that you can avoid that charge. Now, you might say, well, just be honest. Just say that it is a nakedly political change. And I think it's more of a dance there. I think governments can't just do nakedly political changes to something like the electoral system or the system of local government, because in a sense you're adjusting the rules of the game. So I think you do have to at least give some concession to considerations beyond naked partisanship. At the same time, governments should not operate with a political suicide wish, and it's not unreasonable that governments might pursue certain reforms within, I think, a boundary of tolerance that are neutral or modestly advantageous to their own political position. It may be that people don't like that. It may look a bit dirty and self-serving. I think that's almost inescapable when you have politicians that ultimately have to make these decisions.
Just quickly on that point, I think you took much too narrowly what I was saying when I said these were political decisions. By political, I don't just mean is it in the partisan interest of the party that's proposing or agreeing to it. I mean that basically the question of who is represented with whom, what is a council boundary, is basically a political question rather than a bureaucratic one. And that if you were to answer the question, some of those I mentioned before, should rural and urban areas be represented together or differently? Sure, there's a partisan dynamic and expectation underlying that perhaps, but it's actually just a question of politics and what should our political framework look like that should be considered in more political terms. A very final thought from my side, though, is that whilst there's a logic undoubtedly to a single tier local government and what you say about having just a single tier of councils that are responsible for most services, of course, beneath even district councils now there are parish and town councils which do a lot as well in certain parts of the country, particularly rural areas like where I represent. Whilst there's a logic to having single tier though between district and county, there's also actually something of a logic about the old system as well. There's a logic to saying there are certain things that can best be done at a strategic level across a much bigger area, and then there are certain things where local intelligence and a more local understanding are more important. And actually, you see that in some of the examples we've been talking about. If you think that something like adult social care or highways, perhaps, is something where a more strategic, wider view is necessary, well, that is done at the Oxfordshire-wide level. So that takes in the whole county. But if you think that urban and rural areas have different needs, well, you have a city council in Oxford, and then you have district councils that cover more rural areas. So whilst you do get the risk of confusion about accountability, all of which I accept, there is something of a logic actually to that. And one of the things that we've seen, even with unitary councils, when they tend to be smaller, and they're almost always smaller than the old county councils, is they quite often share some backroom services. It's as is the case with almost anything. There's no perfect model. There's better and worse in subjective opinion. But certainly, I think it's an issue which, for a lot of people, local government matters a lot to their local area and the communities in which they live. And I rather wish the issue got more attention.
Well, that's it for this episode of Since Attlee Churchill. We'll be back on Sunday with our regular programming, and we're actually going to go back to our normal historical episodes for a couple of weeks. We've been doing our summer book club where we've been interviewing authors, Lee included, about their recent books on British politics and political history. And we're going to pick that up a little bit later in the summer, but we know that some of our listeners have missed hearing our forays into post-war British political history. And so we're going to bring that back for a couple of weeks. And we hope that you enjoy those episodes when they come.
The next one will be out on Sunday, and we'll see you then.
Thanks very much.